I should have known something was wrong when she stopped asking about my day. That was back in March, before everything unraveled. I taught high school English for 11 years at Riverside Academy, a private school on the north side of Chicago where parents paid $30,000 a year and expected their kids to get into Northwestern or better. I was good at it too, won Teacher of the Year twice, ran the debate team, coached kids through college essays on weekends for free because I actually believed in the work. My wife Elena taught art at the same school, different building across the courtyard, and we'd been there together since we were both 26. We met during new teacher orientation when they paired us up for some icebreaker activity that involved building a tower out of spaghetti and marshmallows. Her tower fell immediately, and she laughed so hard she snorted, and I was gone right there. We got married 3 years later in her parents' backyard in Evanston, bought a condo in Lincoln Park that we could barely afford but told ourselves we'd grow into. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen so small only one person could cook at a time. We painted the living room ourselves that first weekend, got more paint on each other than the walls, ordered pizza at midnight, and ate it sitting on the floor because we hadn't moved the furniture in yet. The trouble started small, so small I almost missed it. Budget cuts, they said. The headmaster called a faculty meeting in January and explained that enrollment was down for the first time in the school's history. Donations were soft, and they needed to make some adjustments. Nothing dramatic, just tightening belts. A hiring freeze, reduced discretionary budgets, maybe combining some sections. I remember Elena squeezed my hand during that meeting and whispered that we'd be fine because we were both tenured and they couldn't just let us go without cause. By February, they'd cut 2 positions in the science department and combined some elective classes. People were nervous, but not panicking. The teacher's lounge had this low hum of anxiety, people talking quieter than usual, some updating their resumes just in case. I kept teaching my AP literature sections, kept meeting with students who needed extra help, kept showing up early and staying late, because that's what I always did. Elena seemed quieter than usual, but I figured she was just stressed about the uncertainty like everyone else. Her department had already lost their ceramics program, and she was worried they'd cut deeper. The first real sign came on a Tuesday in early March. I'd stayed after school to help a student revise her essay on the Great Gatsby and came home around 7 to find Elena sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, which wasn't unusual, but she was just staring at it, not drinking, not looking at her phone, not doing anything, just sitting there. I asked if she was okay, and she said yeah, just tired. I heated up some leftover stir-fry from the night before, and we ate mostly in silence. When I tried to talk about my day, about the student's essay, or the department meeting where we'd argued about summer reading lists, she gave these short responses and kept checking her phone. This went on for maybe 2 weeks. She'd be distant, then normal, then distant again. Some nights, she'd come home late, say she'd been working on curriculum planning or meeting with parents. Other nights, she'd be home before me, but already in bed when I got there, claiming she had a headache or was just exhausted. I kept thinking she was worried about her job or maybe about money since we'd been talking about starting a family and our savings weren't where we wanted them to be. We'd looked at our budget a few months earlier and realized we'd need at least another year of saving before we could afford childcare on top of everything else. One night, I directly asked her if something was bothering her, if she wanted to talk about the stress at work or if there was something else going on. She looked at me like I'd accused her of something and said no. Everything's fine. Why are you being weird about it? The way she said it made me feel like I was imagining things, like I was being paranoid or clingy. So I backed off and tried to give her space. Then in late March, the headmaster called me into his office. Just me, not Elena, which I thought was strange since usually when there were school-wide issues, they'd address departments or divisions together. Stuart Brennan had been headmaster for about a year at that point, hired from some prep school in Massachusetts to modernize our approach and increase enrollment. He was younger than the previous headmaster, maybe early 40s, wore expensive suits, and talked a lot about innovation and competitive positioning. He sat behind his desk with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between concerned and disappointed, and told me there had been some concerns raised about my teaching methods. I asked what kind of concerns, and he said he'd received feedback from parents that I was assigning inappropriate texts and fostering divisive discussions in my classroom. He used those exact words, divisive discussions, like having students actually think critically about literature was somehow problematic. I was completely blindsided. I've been teaching the same curriculum for years, stuff like Beloved and The Handmaid's Tale and 1984 and Invisible Man, all books that were literally on the approved reading list that had been vetted by the curriculum committee years ago. I asked who had complained and what specifically they'd objected to, and he said he couldn't disclose that, but that I needed to be more mindful of the community values and consider the diverse perspectives of our parent body, which was a funny way of putting it since our parent body was about 90% white and wealthy. I asked if there was a specific change he wanted me to make, and he said he'd like me to submit my lesson plans for review going forward and to focus on more canonical texts that wouldn't generate controversy. I pointed out that half the books I taught were canonical and the other half were award-winning contemporary literature, and he just nodded and said he appreciated my perspective, but that we needed to be strategic about optics right now, given the enrollment challenges. I left his office feeling like I'd been slapped. Went straight home, even though it was only 3 in the afternoon, and when I walked in, Elena was there, which was unusual because she usually had after-school art club on Tuesdays. I told her about the meeting, about the complaints and Stuart's vague warnings, and she barely reacted. She just said that maybe I should be more careful, that times were different now, and people were more sensitive about things. It felt like she was taking their side instead of mine. I asked her what she meant by more careful, and she said she didn't want to get into it, that she had papers to grade. I stood there in our kitchen, watching her gather her things, and moved to the bedroom, closing the door behind her, and I felt this distance between us that I couldn't name. Like we were in the same apartment, but living in different realities. The complaints kept coming. Small things at first, parents saying I'd made their kid feel uncomfortable during a discussion about race in Invisible Man. Another parent objecting to the sexual content in The Handmaid's Tale, even though I'd sent home permission slips at the beginning of the semester like I always did. Someone complained that I'd been dismissive when their son asked why we had to read so many books by women and minorities, though what actually happened was I'd explained that we were reading books by great writers, and that happened to include people who weren't dead white men. Stuart started sitting in on my classes, showing up without warning and taking notes in the back row. Every time I tried to have a real conversation about what was happening, about whether there was an actual problem or if this was just some parent relations thing he needed to manage, he'd give me these vague warnings about being more balanced and appropriate. He'd say things like, we need to make sure every student feels welcome, and I understand your passion for these texts, but we have to consider the bigger picture. I started second-guessing everything I said in class. I'd plan a discussion about gender roles in The Great Gatsby and then water it down to basic plot questions because I was afraid someone would complain. I stopped assigning essays that asked students to connect text to contemporary issues. I caught myself avoiding eye contact with certain students whose parents I knew had money and influence with the board. By April, I was barely sleeping. I'd lie awake going over my lesson plans, replaying classroom discussions, try to figure out where I'd gone wrong or what I could do differently. Elena would already be asleep or pretending to be, turned away from me on her side of the bed with the covers pulled up to her shoulders. We'd stopped having real conversations about anything beyond logistics. When I tried to talk about what was happening at work, she'd change the subject or say she didn't want to bring work stress home, which was ironic since we literally worked at the same place. I noticed she was dressing differently, taking more care with her appearance in the morning. New clothes I hadn't seen before, spending more time on her makeup. When I mentioned it, she said she was just trying to look more professional since there were going to be board members visiting campus more frequently. She started working late more often, coming home at 8 or 9 with takeout containers, saying she'd grab dinner with some colleagues after a curriculum meeting. One night, I asked who she'd been eating with, and she listed off a few names, including Stuart. She said it so casually like it meant nothing, but something in my gut twisted. I asked why the headmaster was at curriculum meetings for the art department, and she got defensive, said he was involved in all departments now, that he was trying to be more hands-on. I didn't push it further because I was afraid of what I might find out if I did. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in late April. The headmaster called me in again, and this time the head of HR was there too, a woman named Patricia, who I'd maybe spoken to 3 times in 11 years. They told me that multiple families had formally requested their students be moved out of my classes for the fall, and that the board had decided it would be best if I took a leave of absence for the remainder of the semester. Paid, they said like that made it better. Stuart explained that this wasn't a termination, just a pause while things cooled down, but that I needed to not be in the building starting Monday. I asked what I was supposed to tell my students, and Patricia said they'd handle the communication with parents and would assign a substitute to finish out the semester. I asked if I was being fired, and Stuart said no. This was administrative leave with pay, but I could hear in his voice that this was the beginning of the end. He walked me through some paperwork, talked about how I could use this time to reflect on my pedagogical approach, maybe take some professional development courses. The whole time he had this expression that I couldn't read, something almost like satisfaction. I drove home shaking, hands barely steady on the wheel. When I got to the condo, Elena wasn't back yet, which was unusual because she usually got home before me on Thursdays. I sat in our living room on the couch we'd bought at a tent sale our second year of marriage, just staring at the wall, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed a few times, texts from colleagues who'd already heard somehow, asking if I was okay or if I needed anything. I didn't respond to any of them. When Elena finally came in around 8, I told her everything. I explained about the meeting, about the formal request from families, about the leave of absence that we both knew was really the first step toward pushing me out. Her response was so flat it scared me. She just stood there in the doorway with her bag still on her shoulder and said, "Okay, well, maybe this is for the best. You can take some time to figure things out." I asked her what that meant, what I was supposed to figure out, and she set down her bag very carefully and looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Resolved? Maybe you're just tired. She said she thought maybe we needed some space too, that she'd been thinking about it for a while, and this seemed like a sign, that everything was falling apart anyway, and maybe we shouldn't keep pretending. I actually laughed because it was so absurd. Asked her if she was seriously choosing now to tell me she wanted space when my career was imploding and I'd just been effectively fired from the job I'd built my entire adult life around. She said that was exactly the problem, that my career had always been the most important thing, and she was tired of being second. That she'd spent 11 years watching me pour everything into work while our marriage became an afterthought. We fought for the first time in months. Real fighting. Not the cold silence we'd been living in, but actual raised voices and accusations flying back and forth. I said she was being unfair, that I'd always supported her work and her career, and that it wasn't my fault the school was suddenly targeting me for doing my job. She said I was being oblivious, that I'd been checked out of our relationship for years, and this wasn't about the school, this was about us. I asked her if there was someone else, and she got very still. Just froze for a second with this look on her face like I'd reached into her chest and grabbed something she'd been hiding. Then she said no, but I didn't believe her. The pause was too long, her voice too careful. I asked again, and she said she wasn't doing this right now, that she was going to pack a bag and stay with her sister for a few days, and I should use the time to think about what I actually wanted. She went into the bedroom, and I heard drawers opening and closing, hangers scraping against the closet rod. When she came out 15 minutes later with an overnight bag, I asked her again if she was seeing someone, and she looked me right in the eye and said it doesn't matter, we're broken anyway. Then she walked out. She didn't come back in a few days. She texted on Sunday saying she needed more time, that she wasn't ready to talk yet. I asked how much time, and she said she didn't know, to please just give her space. A week became 2 weeks. I called her sister once, and her sister very carefully said that Elena needed space, and I should respect that Elena would reach out when she was ready. I asked if her sister knew what was going on, if Elena had told her anything, and there was this long pause before she said she thought Elena and I should talk directly. I spent those weeks in the condo alone, not teaching, not doing much of anything except reading the school handbook over and over trying to find where I'd violated some policy, where I'd stepped over some invisible line that made me worthy of being pushed out. I'd wake up at my normal time, 6 in the morning, and then realize I had nowhere to go. Some days I'd go for runs, long ones that left me exhausted and empty. Other days I'd just sit on the couch and watch whatever was on TV, not really seeing it. Friends from school reached out at first.